The Chief Justice stepped out of the courthouse as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the city streets with a soft orange glow. The day had been long, filled with hearings, paperwork, and meetings. Normally, this part of the evening was quiet, almost peaceful, a chance to breathe before heading home. But today, that peace was shattered in the most unexpected and humiliating way. As he walked toward his car, parked at the edge of the street, he noticed a patrol car slowly approaching. At first, he didn't think much of it. Police cars patrolling city streets at this hour were common. But when the vehicle stopped directly in front of him, lights flashing, a sinking feeling settled in his stomach. 2 officers stepped out. Their expressions were rigid, cold, and unyielding. One of the officers called out sharply, demanding that he stop and show his identification. The Chief Justice, confused and slightly alarmed, held up his badge calmly, expecting recognition and perhaps a brief apology for the interruption. Instead, the officers exchanged glances that suggested they didn't care about his identity. They ordered him to step back and then handcuffed him without explanation. Shock coursed through him. He was a man of law, a figure whose word and presence carried authority in courtrooms. Yet here he was, treated like a criminal on the street. He opened his mouth to protest, to explain, but his words seemed to vanish in the cold evening air. The officers ignored his attempts and guided him toward the patrol car. He noticed a few bystanders beginning to gather, their faces a mix of curiosity, concern, and disbelief. Some took out their phones, recording what was happening, unsure if they were witnessing a mistake or a deliberate injustice. Inside the patrol car, the Chief Justice tried to reason with the officers. His voice was calm but carried an edge of desperation. He explained who he was, described his position, showed his badge, and even referenced the cases he had presided over that day. Each statement, instead of being acknowledged, was met with a dismissive shrug or a hard stare. It was as if his identity meant nothing to them, as if the authority he wielded every day held no weight on the sidewalk. Time passed slowly inside the car. Every minute stretched into an eternity. The lights from the city blurred through the windows, a reminder that the world outside was moving on while he was trapped in this injustice. He thought about the irony. A man who had spent his life upholding justice now found himself powerless against prejudice. His heart pounded not with fear alone but with frustration, disbelief, and a profound sadness. The officers, unbothered by his protests, continued with their routine as if he were invisible. One of them muttered under his breath, something the Chief Justice caught clearly, a remark that carried disdain and something far darker, an assumption about him based solely on the color of his skin. That single sentence, whispered but cutting, made him realize the depth of the problem he faced. It was not just an error or a misunderstanding. It was a prejudice rooted deep within, a bias that no badge or position could erase. Outside, the small crowd that had begun to gather grew restless. People whispered among themselves, pointing at the patrol car, questioning the officers and trying to understand what had provoked such treatment. Some looked on with fear, unsure if stepping in would bring danger upon themselves. Others simply recorded the scene, hoping that evidence would later make a difference. But the Chief Justice, sitting in the back seat, felt the humiliation acutely. Each whisper, each gaze amplified the absurdity and injustice of the moment. He was a figure of law, yet here he was, treated like a suspect for no reason at all. He attempted to appeal to their humanity, explaining that he had never broken any law, that his life was dedicated to justice, that he had spent decades ensuring that others were treated fairly. His voice was steady, but inside anger and sorrow battled for dominance. He was no longer just fighting for himself, but for the principles he had devoted his life to uphold. In that confined space, the patrol car became a symbol of systemic bias, a place where prejudice could override truth and authority. Minutes felt like hours. He thought of his family, colleagues, and the countless people who depended on the judiciary to be impartial and fair. He imagined the headlines that would follow, the questions that would arise, the trust that might be shaken. Yet in that moment, all he could do was sit, restrained and powerless, and plead for a recognition that never came. His badge, his title, his years of service meant nothing against the officer's preconceived notions. The air inside the car was heavy, filled with tension and silence. Occasionally, the officers spoke to each other in low tones, discussing what to do next. But they never looked at him, never acknowledged his presence as anything more than an obstacle in their path. The Chief Justice tried to maintain composure, breathing slowly, reminding himself that panic would only worsen the situation. He focused on staying calm, using the same clarity and reason he employed in courtrooms, though here it seemed almost useless. Outside, the city continued its rhythm. Cars passed by, oblivious to the drama unfolding on the sidewalk. Streetlights flickered, and the hum of the city was constant, indifferent to the plight of a man who had once wielded significant power. Yet the onlookers remained, their phones capturing the scene, their murmurs growing louder. Some shouted questions at the officers, demanding an explanation, while others simply observed, the tension thick in the air. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the Chief Justice was escorted into the police station. The building, usually a symbol of law and order, felt oppressive and alien now. The bright fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the room as he was seated, still handcuffed, at a small table. Forms were filled out, questions asked and repeated, but none addressed the real issue. His protests, his explanations, his identity, none of it seemed to matter. The officers were following procedure, yet that procedure was tainted by a personal bias that no amount of proof could overcome. He thought back to the day's work, the cases he had presided over, the lives he had impacted with fairness and careful judgment. How could it be that in a matter of moments he was reduced to a mere suspect? The thought was unbearable. He felt a profound sense of isolation, not just physically but socially and morally. Justice, which he had always believed in, now seemed distant, fragile, and elusive. The hours dragged on. He was questioned repeatedly, the same questions phrased differently, each time a reminder that the officers were unconvinced, unmoved, unrelenting. Every attempt to clarify, to assert the truth, was met with skepticism. His words, usually enough to command respect in a courtroom, bounced off the walls like echoes in an empty hall. The helplessness was suffocating, yet amidst the despair he remained composed. He refused to let anger dictate his behavior. He knew that losing control could worsen the situation, and he clung to the principles that had guided his life: patience, reason, and dignity. He spoke clearly, answered every question, and tried to remain polite despite the deep injustice of his situation. It was a test of character, one he had never imagined facing in such a personal and humiliating way. As the night wore on, the Chief Justice began to notice the quiet tension among the officers themselves. He realized that some were uncomfortable, perhaps aware on some level that this treatment was wrong, yet too constrained by culture, habit, or fear to act differently. That realization offered little comfort. The injustice was real, immediate, and unrelenting. By the time the first hints of dawn began to creep through the blinds of the police station, the Chief Justice's mind was racing. He thought about the next steps, about the larger implications of this incident. The humiliation was intense, but he knew that his response, his composure, and his insistence on truth would matter far beyond this one night. The world was watching, whether in person or through screens, and this moment would not be forgotten easily. Sitting alone in the stark, fluorescent-lit room, he reflected on the strange reversal of power. For decades he had held authority, made difficult decisions, and guided others in understanding right from wrong. Now stripped of freedom and respect, he experienced firsthand what so many others endured daily due to prejudice. The lesson was bitter but undeniable. As he waited, he began to prepare himself for the next part of this ordeal. He would need patience, clarity, and the strength to endure further humiliation. Yet beneath the calm exterior, a fire burned, a determination to face the injustice with dignity and eventually seek accountability. The night was long, the experience demeaning, but the Chief Justice held on to one unwavering truth. The principles of fairness and justice could not be erased, even in the face of personal suffering. The Chief Justice sat in the small, cold room, handcuffs pressing against his wrists, the weight of humiliation pressing down even harder. He tried to steady his breathing, but it was difficult. Every few minutes, an officer would glance at him with suspicion, as if trying to detect any lie, any trick, any proof that he wasn't who he claimed to be. It was exhausting and deeply frustrating. He had always relied on the clarity of law, on reason and evidence to guide decisions. But here, in this dimly lit room, logic had no power. He recalled the looks from the officers when he first showed them his badge, Their eyes had shifted from brief acknowledgement to something distant, dismissive. It was then he realized that no badge, no title, no decades of service could immediately undo the bias embedded in their minds. They were seeing only what they wanted to see, and it was terrifying. The realization was painful. Even the highest authority in the land could be stripped of respect in an instant if prejudice was allowed to dictate action. He tried to speak again, explaining his position calmly, step by step. He described the day's work, the hearings, the cases he had ruled on, and the responsibilities he carried. His voice carried a quiet urgency, a mixture of authority and humility. But each time the officers would respond with skepticism or silence. They seemed convinced that he was merely playing a role, that he was trying to manipulate them. No words, no credentials, no demonstration of truth mattered. The Chief Justice's mind wandered briefly to the lives he had touched through his work. He thought of the people who had come to court seeking justice, the decisions he had made to protect rights, to defend the innocent, to ensure fairness. All of that seemed meaningless now. The irony was sharp and bitter. He had dedicated his life to ensuring that no person was wronged without cause, yet here he was, wronged without reason. Outside the room, he could hear the faint murmur of voices. Some officers moved quickly, carrying out routine tasks, but he could sense the tension beneath the surface. They were aware that something unusual was happening, but no one had stepped in to stop it. The system, which he had always believed to be balanced and fair, now felt rigid, unfeeling, and at times cruel. He tried to reason with the officers again, his words measured and deliberate. He spoke about integrity, about respect, about the importance of seeing beyond assumptions. He reminded them, politely but firmly, that every person deserved to be treated according to truth, not prejudice. His appeals were met with blank stares or nods that lacked conviction. It was as if he were speaking to walls, echoing ideas into emptiness. Time moved slowly, stretching each second into a long, heavy minute. He began to notice small details he had ignored before: the flicker of the fluorescent lights overhead, the slight creak of a chair in the corner, the rhythmic tapping of a keyboard from another office. Every sound became amplified in the silence, reminding him of the separation between himself and the outside world. Every passing moment reinforced the helplessness he felt, and yet he refused to lose composure. A few civilians had gathered outside the station, drawn by curiosity and concern. Some tried to speak with the officers, asking why a man of his position was being detained. Their voices carried a mix of frustration and fear. They were strangers, yet they seemed to sense the injustice before them. From behind the walls of the station, the Chief Justice could hear faint shouts and murmurs, a reminder that people were watching, recording, and questioning. In that, there was a small spark of hope, a reminder that the truth might eventually emerge. He thought about the broader implications of what was happening. This was not just about him. It was about every person who had ever faced prejudice and bias, who had been judged before being heard. He felt the weight of responsibility not only to himself, but to the principles he had defended his entire life. If he could not withstand this moment with dignity, what hope was there for others? The thought added a layer of resolve, sharpening his focus even amid humiliation. He began to speak quietly, more to himself than to the officers. He recited the principles of law, the ideals of justice he had upheld, reminding himself of the foundation of his career. It was a coping mechanism, a way to maintain a sense of control when the external world seemed chaotic and unfair. He felt the words fortify him, creating a mental barrier against despair. Hours passed. The officers occasionally questioned him, their tone alternating between irritation and cautious curiosity. They asked the same questions repeatedly, looking for inconsistencies, yet his answers were consistent, clear, and truthful. He sensed their frustration building, but he remained calm, careful not to let impatience or anger show. Every word was deliberate, every gesture controlled. In that room, his dignity became his shield. The Chief Justice began to notice subtle human reactions among the officers. Some avoided direct eye contact as if sensing the injustice of the situation. Others seemed uncomfortable, shifting their weight or fidgeting. It was a reminder that even within a flawed system there were traces of humanity, however faint. That observation gave him a small, quiet comfort, though it did not lessen the weight of his current predicament. As the evening turned into night, fatigue began to settle into his bones. He felt the physical strain of remaining seated, restrained, and alert. His mind, however, remained sharp. He thought about potential next steps, about how to navigate the situation without escalating it, about how to ensure that the truth would eventually prevail. Strategy and patience became as important as dignity and composure. He considered the role of public perception. He knew that people outside the station were already speculating, that recordings and social media might spread the story quickly. He reflected on how perceptions could shape reality, how narratives could be influenced by bias and partial understanding. Yet he also recognized the power of truth, of calm, rational explanation, and the importance of standing firm even when the world seemed hostile. The Chief Justice tried to rest, leaning back slightly in the uncomfortable chair, but sleep was elusive. His mind was filled with a mix of frustration, reflection, and determination. Every moment of helplessness was balanced by a renewed commitment to his principles. He reminded himself that this experience, as painful as it was, could also serve as a lesson, both personally and for society at large. He thought about his colleagues, imagining how they might react if they knew what had happened. He imagined their support, their concern, and their shared commitment to justice. That thought provided a small sense of connection in an otherwise isolating situation. Even in the face of direct prejudice, he was not entirely alone. Occasionally, he spoke quietly to himself, rehearsing what he might say if given the opportunity to address a broader audience. He thought about the importance of fairness, of empathy, and of accountability. He reflected on how systemic issues could allow bias to override reason, and how critical it was to confront such moments with clarity and patience. Through the long hours, he maintained a careful balance between emotion and reason. Anger was natural, he knew, but expressing it recklessly could worsen the situation. Fear was understandable, but succumbing to it would mean surrendering the principles he had spent his life defending. He focused instead on maintaining presence of mind, observing the behavior of the officers, and preparing for whatever might come next. By midnight, the Chief Justice had learned more about human nature than he had expected. He saw how prejudice could distort perception, how authority could be questioned, and how individuals could act against reason under social or cultural pressures. Yet he also saw glimpses of decency, moments of hesitation, subtle acknowledgments that not everyone involved was completely indifferent to justice. Those observations strengthened his resolve to endure and respond thoughtfully. He realized that the situation was not just about immediate freedom or humiliation. It was about exposing systemic flaws, about shining light on issues often ignored, about creating awareness that could lead to change. In that understanding, he found a measure of empowerment. Though physically restrained and socially diminished in that moment, his mind remained free, his principles intact, and his determination growing. As the hours crawled toward dawn, he continued to speak with the officers, answering questions patiently, clarifying misunderstandings, and appealing subtly to reason. His calm demeanor and unwavering truth created moments of hesitation and doubt among some officers. Though the immediate situation had not changed, these small cracks offered hope that fairness might yet prevail. The Chief Justice remained aware that endurance alone was not enough. He needed to remain strategic, to observe, to prepare for intervention from higher authorities, and to ensure that the truth could be communicated effectively. Every choice he made in that room, every word he spoke, carried weight. The way he conducted himself could shape outcomes not only for himself, but for the principles he represented. In the quiet moments, he reflected on the irony of life and justice. Here he was, a figure of immense authority and responsibility, reduced to a state of dependency on the very system he had spent decades shaping. Yet in that reversal he found clarity. The principles he had championed were not just abstract ideals. They were lived experiences, essential to human dignity and fairness. Enduring this moment would not only test him personally, but the hours in the police station dragged on with the weight of silence pressing down. The Chief Justice had spoken, explained, clarified, and yet he remained in handcuffs, surrounded by officers who refused to see him as anything more than a suspect. The initial shock had faded, replaced by a deeper, more profound understanding of his helplessness. He realized that facts alone would not free him here. He needed to reach them on a human level, to touch the part of them that could feel fairness, empathy, or conscience. He began to shift his approach. Calm reasoning had failed. Polite explanation had failed. And he understood now that the officer's bias was rooted deeply and emotionally. There was no quick proof that could override their assumptions. He would have to appeal differently, not as a Chief Justice commanding respect, but as a human being, vulnerable, aware of his own dignity, and willing to ask for understanding. "Please," he said quietly, his voice carrying a humility that was almost foreign to him in professional settings. "If I have caused any offense, knowingly or unknowingly, I ask for forgiveness. I only wish to follow the law and respect those who enforce it." The words felt strange as they left his lips. In his courtroom, he had rarely asked for forgiveness. He had been the arbiter, the one granting it. Now he was pleading. A reversal that made his chest tighten and his mind race. But the plea was sincere, stripped of authority and pride, aimed directly at the humanity he hoped still existed within the officers. One officer looked at him with a flicker of confusion, a slight shift in expression that suggested the words had landed differently than the usual statements of identity or credentials. The Chief Justice continued, his tone steady, his words deliberate. He spoke of respect, of fairness, and of the need to treat each person as a human being first, regardless of appearances or assumptions. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional scratch of a pen on paper. The officers exchanged brief glances, whispers too quiet for him to hear, and yet he could feel the subtle shift in the air. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a crack in the wall of bias, a moment where reason and empathy could begin to seep in. He reflected inwardly on the vulnerability of asking for forgiveness. It required acknowledging a moment of powerlessness, something he rarely experienced in public life. He had spent years making decisions that impacted the lives of others, yet here he was, dependent on the willingness of strangers to see truth and act justly. The humility was painful, yet he embraced it, understanding that it might be the only way to bridge the gap. "Every life has value," he said softly, almost to himself at first, but loud enough for the officers to hear. "Every person deserves respect, not because of their title or their rank, but because they are human. I am human. I ask for the chance to show that, to be seen clearly, without assumptions clouding judgment." He noticed one of the officers shifting uneasily, perhaps feeling a trace of guilt or discomfort. The Chief Justice seized the opportunity to continue, not accusing, not demanding, but appealing to conscience. He spoke of shared humanity, of the fragility of trust, of the consequences of allowing prejudice to dictate actions. His words were measured, careful, and deeply sincere. Time seemed to slow further. Each sentence carried weight. Each pause held the tension of uncertainty. He felt the rawness of his own exposure, the fear of continued humiliation, yet he also felt a quiet strength. This was not about controlling the situation with authority. It was about connecting on a level that authority could never reach. He imagined what the world outside was seeing, the murmurs of bystanders, the recordings on phones capturing the unfolding injustice. The Chief Justice knew that his plea for understanding was not just for the officers in the room, but for the public, for the principle of fairness itself. Every word, every gesture was part of a larger effort to awaken awareness and accountability. Hours passed with only minor acknowledgement from the officers. They remained largely unyielding, their bias still a barrier. But in those quiet moments, the Chief Justice observed micro-reactions, a slight softening of a jaw, a longer pause before responding, eyes flickering with unease. It was not complete acceptance, but it was something, a reminder that human hearts could shift even slowly, even reluctantly. The Chief Justice leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "I am not asking for special treatment," he said. "I am asking for fairness. I am asking to be seen for who I am, not for assumptions about my appearance or background. That is all any of us deserve." The words hung in the air, fragile yet strong, a bridge stretched across a gap of misunderstanding and bias. He did not know if they would succeed, if the officers would truly hear, but he spoke with the courage of one who had nothing left to lose except dignity itself. In the quiet that followed, he thought about his family, about colleagues who trusted him, about the countless people who looked to the law for protection. Their reliance added weight to his plea. This was not just personal. It was symbolic, a small but significant stand against injustice. He realized that the manner in which he responded now could influence perceptions, encourage reflection, and potentially inspire change beyond the walls of the station. As the night continued, he remained patient, careful to maintain composure even as frustration rose within him. The officers asked occasional questions, their tone a mix of procedural routine and subtle tension. Each time he responded calmly, consistently, and with unwavering clarity. There was no anger, no confrontation, only a steady human appeal for recognition and fairness. He began to imagine the broader impact of this moment. The public might see him humbled, perhaps vulnerable, yet they would also witness the courage in maintaining dignity under unjust treatment. He thought about the lessons that could be learned, the awareness that could be raised, and the conversations that might follow about bias, assumptions, and respect for every individual. The Chief Justice also reflected on the internal strength required to ask for forgiveness when none was owed. It was a paradox, humbling and yet empowering. By humbling himself, he retained moral authority. By pleading for understanding, he preserved the integrity of the principles he represented. There was a quiet power in that act, a strength that could not be taken by force or by prejudice. Minutes blurred into hours. He continued speaking softly, carefully, appealing not with authority but with empathy. His tone was consistent, his words deliberate, each sentence building upon the last to create a tapestry of human connection. He spoke of respect, fairness, shared humanity, and the importance of looking beyond assumptions. The room remained tense, but there were small shifts, subtle acknowledgments of his sincerity. At one point he paused, letting the silence speak as loudly as words could. In that pause he sensed a collective reflection, however faint. The officers were still guarded, still bound by bias, but the Chief Justice could see the beginnings of an internal dialogue within them. A quiet questioning of assumptions they had taken for granted. He reminded himself to remain patient, to understand that change, even in small moments, required time. The plea for forgiveness was not a sign of weakness. It was a deliberate, courageous act, aimed at opening the door to empathy where authority and logic had failed. Every second of this effort, every word was a step toward acknowledgement and eventual justice. Through the long hours, he felt a mixture of fear, hope, despair, and resilience. The experience was grueling, emotionally and mentally. Yet it revealed the complexity of human interaction and the deep need for understanding and compassion. He realized that justice was not only about law and procedure, but also about connection, perception, and recognition of shared humanity. As the night neared its end, the Chief Justice remained steadfast. He continued to speak carefully, earnestly, without yielding to frustration or despair. His words were not just for himself or the officers, but for the principle of fairness, the public who might witness, and the broader message about the consequences of prejudice. Every plea, every humble request for understanding, was part of a larger story that could influence awareness and reflection. Though he did not yet know whether his words would change the immediate situation, he maintained a quiet dignity and a determined focus. The act of asking for forgiveness, of humbly appealing to the humanity in others, had transformed the nature of his struggle. It was no longer just about being recognized as Chief Justice. It was about asserting the importance of respect, fairness, and human connection, even in the face of systemic bias. By the time the first rays of dawn began to seep through the windows, the Chief Justice had spent hours pleading, explaining, and appealing to human empathy. He remained in the same room, still under restraint, but something subtle had shifted. The officers, though not fully convinced, had glimpsed the depth of sincerity, the weight of the plea, and the undeniable. After the events of the day, the Chief Justice returned to the quiet of his office, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. The exhaustion from the previous night and the morning's ordeal pressed on him physically, but his mind was far from rest. He felt a deep mix of emotions, humiliation, relief, sorrow, and determination. Though he had been released, the memory of being restrained and dismissed for who he was remained vivid, a stark reminder of the fragility of respect and the persistence of bias. He sat at his desk, letting the silence of the room wash over him. For a long moment he did nothing but reflect. He thought about the officers, their reactions, the subtle signs of discomfort or hesitation he had noticed. He considered the bystanders and the public who had observed, recorded, and discussed the events. The incident had left marks on everyone involved, though in different ways. It had exposed prejudice, vulnerability, and the urgent need for awareness. In the solitude of his office, he began to analyze the day's events more systematically. He thought about what had gone wrong, why the officers had failed to recognize his authority, and how their biases had led to the wrongful detention. He realized that it was not just about individual actions, but about deeper systemic issues, assumptions, training gaps, and cultural patterns that allowed prejudice to override logic and humanity. Understanding this was essential, he knew, if meaningful change was to follow. The Chief Justice also reflected on his own behavior, his calmness, patience, and humble plea for understanding. He recognized that his approach had been necessary, not only for his personal safety but for the integrity of the situation. By remaining composed and human-centered, he had maintained dignity in the face of injustice, creating the possibility for reflection and change. There was power in restraint and clarity, he realized, a power not always visible but deeply impactful. He thought about the lessons this could teach others. The event had demonstrated that prejudice could affect anyone, even those in positions of authority. It showed that systemic flaws could undermine fairness and dignity, that human bias could distort perception, and that even in modern society, vigilance was necessary to protect justice. He recognized that sharing his experience openly could educate, provoke discussion, and inspire efforts to address these persistent issues. The Chief Justice began making notes outlining the steps he wanted to take. He considered addressing the incident publicly, not to dwell on personal humiliation but to highlight the broader significance. He wanted to speak about fairness, empathy, and the importance of questioning assumptions. His goal was to transform personal suffering into a lesson for society, a reminder that dignity must be actively preserved and bias actively challenged. He also contemplated immediate reforms. Discussions with colleagues in the judiciary and law enforcement were necessary. Policies could be reviewed, training programs improved, and accountability measures strengthened. The Chief Justice understood that real change required both awareness and action. He envisioned programs that emphasized empathy, human understanding, and procedural fairness, aiming to reduce the likelihood of future incidents like the one he had endured. As he worked through these plans, he felt a sense of responsibility not only to himself, but to the larger community. His experience could not remain isolated. It had to serve as a catalyst for reflection, discussion, and reform. He recognized that true leadership was not only about authority and decision-making, but about setting an example, advocating for fairness, and turning adversity into opportunity for growth. Throughout the day, he also reflected on the emotional aspect of the ordeal. The humiliation had been profound, yet it had awakened a heightened awareness of vulnerability, empathy, and the human need for recognition. He realized that his suffering, while personal, could resonate with others who faced bias or discrimination in their lives. His story could offer solidarity, encouragement, and validation to countless individuals who had been dismissed or marginalized. He thought about how he wanted to communicate these insights. Simple, clear language would reach more people. Stories, experiences, and reflections could convey the lessons of fairness and empathy more effectively than abstract arguments. He considered addressing public forums, educational programs, and community meetings, focusing on human connection, understanding, and the importance of challenging assumptions. The Chief Justice also examined the emotional responses of those around him. He remembered the officers' subtle gestures, the hesitation in their voices, and the discomfort he had noticed. He realized that change often begins with small individual shifts in perception, moments when awareness pierces through bias. His patience and sincerity had created those moments, and he knew that they were seeds for broader transformation. He reflected on the media coverage and public discourse that had emerged. People were talking, debating, and questioning. His experience had ignited conversations about fairness, bias, and accountability. He understood that these discussions were essential, that public awareness could reinforce institutional change and societal reflection. The incident, though personally painful, had become a catalyst for education and advocacy. As evening approached, he considered the personal implications of the ordeal. He had faced vulnerability, loss of control, and the stark reality of prejudice. Yet through it all, he had preserved dignity, integrity, and focus. These qualities, he realized, were more important than immediate recognition or respect. They were the foundation of long-term influence, the elements that would sustain him in guiding reform and advocating for fairness. The Chief Justice also reflected on the resilience required to endure such an experience. He acknowledged the fear, frustration, and sorrow he had felt, but recognized the strength in maintaining composure. This resilience, he understood, was not just personal but symbolic, demonstrating to others the power of dignity in the face of adversity. By modeling patience and humanity, he had created a silent lesson that extended beyond the immediate event. He spent hours organizing his thoughts, structuring reflections into clear points, considering how to communicate effectively to different audiences. His focus was on turning suffering into insight, humiliation into awareness, and personal experience into societal learning. He understood that action required clarity, and clarity required reflection, so he worked meticulously to ensure that his message would be coherent, impactful, and human-centered. Throughout the evening, he considered the long-term implications for the judiciary and law enforcement. Systems and procedures must evolve to prevent bias from undermining fairness. Training programs, accountability measures, and awareness initiatives could all benefit from the lessons he had learned firsthand. He envisioned collaborative efforts between legal authorities, community leaders, and public institutions to strengthen fairness and empathy at every level. He also reflected on the emotional strength required for society as a whole to confront bias. Prejudice is often subtle, ingrained, and normalized, making it difficult to address. His experience had highlighted the need for vigilance, reflection, and courage to challenge assumptions. He understood that societal progress depended not only on laws and procedures, but also on the human commitment to empathy, fairness, and integrity. As night deepened, the Chief Justice considered the personal growth that emerged from the ordeal. He had learned the limits of authority, the persistence of prejudice, and the resilience required to maintain dignity. He had discovered the power of humility, patience, and sincerity in influencing others. These lessons, though painful, had strengthened his understanding of human nature and the complexities of justice. He prepared to share these lessons, knowing that communication was key to turning individual experience into collective learning. Through speeches, discussions, and writings, he planned to convey the importance of fairness, the dangers of bias, and the enduring value of dignity. His goal was not to dwell on personal suffering, but to provide insight, provoke reflection, and inspire change. The Chief Justice also considered the emotional well-being of others affected by similar prejudice. His experience could offer validation and support to those who had been marginalized or dismissed. By speaking openly about the ordeal and the lessons learned, he could create solidarity, foster empathy, and encourage proactive efforts to address systemic bias. He recognized that personal stories often carry more impact than abstract principles. By midnight, he had outlined a clear strategy for moving forward. Reflection, communication, advocacy, and reform were all interconnected. He understood that patience and integrity would remain central to every action. The experience, though deeply challenging, had clarified priorities and reinforced the importance of moral courage, human-centered leadership, and consistent advocacy for fairness. In the quiet of the night, the Chief Justice felt a sense of resolution. Though the humiliation had been intense, the experience had become a source of insight, awareness, and potential transformation. He had endured, maintained dignity, and observed subtle shifts in others' perception. He had reflected deeply, planned actionable steps, and prepared to communicate lessons that could extend far beyond his personal experience. He understood that change is gradual, often uncomfortable, and requires both awareness and sustained effort. The Chief Justice had faced an immediate injustice, but by responding with calm, patience, and human-centered reflection, he had created an opportunity for broader societal learning. The personal ordeal had become a vehicle for advocacy, education, and reform. As he finally rested, he considered the journey ahead. There would be meetings, public statements, and initiatives to strengthen fairness and accountability. He would engage with colleagues, institutions, and communities to ensure that the lessons of his experience were integrated into meaningful action. His focus would remain on fairness, dignity, empathy, and systemic improvement. The Chief Justice had transformed personal suffering into reflection, humility into insight, and an act of injustice into an opportunity for societal awareness. He understood that the experience, while painful, had provided clarity, strengthened resilience, and offered a chance to influence change on a broader scale. The ordeal had been a harsh reminder of human imperfection, but it had also revealed the enduring power of dignity, integrity, and moral courage. As dawn approached once again, he felt a quiet determination. The past events, though challenging, had reinforced his commitment to fairness, human empathy, and societal reflection. The humiliation he endured would not define him. Instead, it would guide him, shape his actions, and inspire others. The Chief Justice had faced bias and injustice directly, but he had preserved integrity, demonstrated resilience, and created a foundation for change that extended far beyond the walls of the police station.